So I'm actually going to hand it back to Paul because our very own Paul Doran, co-founder of 10 by 9, has a story to tell us now. So about scars. Work away, Paul. I'll spotlight you. And remember, Paul, keep it to 10 minutes.
She still has one scar. I'm going to start that again. She still has the scar on her ear, but you wouldn't notice it unless you really looked for it. It's now a part of her, as loved as the little chickenpox scar on her lower eyelid, or the favourite freckle on her belly, which I used to kiss each night when putting her to bed. I assume that freckle is still there, but as she's 24 now, it's been some time since I kissed it. It was a scary moment. It was Saturday evening and we had a dinner guest, so it was likely to be a fun evening. And she was showing off a little, excited by the company. She's always been a people person. She was throwing her leg up into the air, but she was so young and so kind of unbalanced. When she fell, it was inevitable. What wasn't inevitable was her catching the side of her head on the corner of the coffee table. There was a half second of silence, then a scream that would terrify any parent. I jumped up and went to her. She was hysterical, and there was blood coming from her ear, a lot of blood. The lobe looked like it had almost been sliced off. And I switched into crisis mode. I'm generally good in a crisis, at least this kind of crisis, where the course of action is very clear. I lifted her up and hugged her, trying to console as best as possible. She kept screaming. She really was hysterical, all encompassing the entirety of that little body racked by noise and pain. We decided immediately she had to go to hospital. I was the only one not to have had anything to drink, so I drove. She kept on crying. Her mummy sat in the back, holding a tea towel to her ear to slow the bleeding. It's never great trying to drive with a screaming infant in the back. But we got to the hospital and she was seen very quickly. Even though it was a Saturday evening, it was too early for the flood of drunken casualties. She was starting to calm down, getting over the shock, maybe starting to enjoy all the attention evening. As I said, she's very much a people person. The doctor was great. She put in a couple of stitches, applied some dressing to the wound, and wrapped a bandage around her head to keep the dressing in place. She looked like she had suffered a serious burn to her face. The bandage was so large. One of our neighbours actually thought that was what had happened. The doctor arranged for us to come back on Monday for further treatment to minimise scarring. She was now calm that she was back home, and she was exhausted by the evening, and off she went to bed, probably with a kiss on her favourite freckle. I too was exhausted. A child in pain will drain all your energy. But there were guests to entertain, and the evening picked up where it had been left off and continued as planned. On the Monday, she went to the hospital for more reparative treatment. I suppose I should tease her about having plastic surgery. She was as calm as anything. A few days later, we got a call from social services and a little visit from a social worker just to make sure the injury was not the result of domestic violence. I know some people can resent that kind of intrusion. I thought it made total sense and reinforced my faith in the system. She had a small scar, and I had a story to tell for the rest of her life. It has become a part of family lore, and there was no real harm done. Nothing to keep me awake at night. What can and does keep me awake at night was a second incident that I didn't even witness, yet still, many years later, still terrifies me. There was a pond in our garden. It was quite nice, but of course, in a house with young children, it had to go. Too dangerous. I had read too many stories of tragedies involving children and ponds. Even if we had enclosed it, that would have never have stopped a determined 3-year-old. And I was always planning to get rid of it. I would get around to it someday soon. Her mother was doing the garden, cutting back something with some very noisy cutting equipment. I think I was at work. The child was playing. She was always a good child and could amuse herself, even though she loved company. I wasn't there when it happened, so I have to give this to you secondhand. Her mother was working when the child appeared, soaking wet and covered in slime. She told her mum she had slipped and fell into the pond. She was able to get herself out, even though it was deep enough to have swallowed her whole. She seemed unfazed and unscarred by the experience. I wasn't there when it happened, as I said, but I was totally scarred by the experience. When I got home and heard what had happened, I was panic stricken. What if, what if I was full of guilt and anger that I had put off getting rid of that bloody pond? Like Rhett Butler, who shot the pony that killed his little girl, I was determined to kill the pond that endangered my little girl. Bucket after bucket after bucket was filled and poured down the drain. I couldn't believe how much water was actually in there, but I emptied it as much as I could, straddling the darned watery hole, adrenaline pumping, and so angry at myself. Eventually realizing I'd have to get wet and dirty to finish the job, I got right in. I remember slipping and sliding on the slime covered plastic lining. I used a Stanley knife or box cutter to cut through the plastic to ensure this would never fill up with water again. Then I filled it with stones, like I had killed it and buried it. At some point, I planned to plant a tree there, but I never got around to it. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and I have a memory of my daughter sitting there watching me, oblivious. For her, this had just been another childhood adventure. To me, it was a living nightmare, but I didn't have to go to sleep to experience it. She says she has no memory of falling into the pond I asked her yesterday, and that's probably a good thing. And she was never afraid of water afterwards. But me, I have visualized it repeatedly. I have had waking nightmares, flashbacks to something I hadn't even witnessed. Her little body flailing in the water, cold, confused, and unable to get out and unable to breathe. I can conjure up those images and the awful emotions that accompany them very easily. The enormity of what might have been. And I am the one with left. I am the one left with the scar from that day.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's such a powerful story of kind of thinking about what could have been, but also a certain kind of guilt that you hold on to.
Yes, indeed. And
I
yet,
know.
literally, I asked her yesterday, did she
Mm,
remember falling in the pond? And she said no. And I
mm,
asked her if she remembered the coffee table incident, and she didn't. But
mm.
she still has a very small scar on the ear.
Okay. And has she always known that she did fall into the pond, or
Oh,
does
I
she not even know it? Oh, okay.
no, she know, yeah, yeah. But she just something that
Yeah.
didn't phase her really.
Mm,
I think I honestly think it was less of a. She's always been fairly comfortable around water, but
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it had long been a fear of mine. I knew that pond was a danger, but I just hadn't got round to doing it. So.